Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, how is US foreign policy impacting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? We'll ask the author and activist Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, author, activist, academic and Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. For decades, he has been a vocal critic of US foreign policy, especially in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's also the author of many books, including Gaza in Crisis. So Noam, welcome to the stream. It is great to have you.
Thank you very much.
Now, as always, in the stream, we have Malika Palau. She is our digital producer. A little bit of extra spice, though, in the way that we connect with our community today.
Yes, I think we both love these type of shows because we're joined by a few extra people. So today, standing by in our stream hangout, we have a group of people ready to chat with Professor Chomsky. Today, we have Danya Helu in Memphis, Tennessee, Max Marder in New York City, Jacob Patterson Stein in Washington, D.C., and Yakub Kura in Los Angeles. Now, you at home, you can be part of this conversation too. Just use the hashtag AJStream.
So the US Secretary of State John Kerry said this recently, Professor. We also believe that any process to resolve the crisis in Gaza in a lasting and meaningful way must lead to the disarmament of Hamas and all terrorist groups. So he said that just recently. What would be your response to that line of thinking?
To ask the resistance to disarm while they're under brutal attack is not a very serious proposal. This is quite independent of whether one approves or disapproves of particular Hamas policies. Hamas's general policies, I think, are represented, for example, by its agreement to join the unity government. That's what set off the latest range of Israeli atrocities. Go back a couple of months, Fatah and Hamas formed the unity government, and Hamas agreed within that unity government to accept every demand of the so-called quartet, the United States, European Union, United Nations and Russia. That means basically the United States. The United States had demands, recognition of Israel, end of violence, and so on. Hamas agreed to be part of a government which would accept all of those demands. That instantly led to a violent reaction on the part of the Israeli government, became even more extreme when the United States gave mild support for it. And that led right on to the latest assault against Gaza. That goes back to deeper reasons. Go back to the Oslo Accord, go back to the early 90s, the Oslo Accords. They explicitly determined that Gaza and the West Bank are a single territorial entity whose integrity cannot be broken, called for a passage between them to ensure that they could be a single entity. Israel and the United States instantly sought to separate the two, and they've been doing so ever since.
A lot of the tweets look a little something like this from Azaz Baz, who says, "We see this cycle of violence erupting in Gaza every few years, and yet Israel has failed to disrupt it. What do they gain?" So all of the questions are on this topic, and I want to pivot off of that to our hangout, where there's a similar question from Danya. And Danya is speaking to us from Memphis, Tennessee. And Danya, I know that you studied Noam Chomsky's work for your thesis. You recently graduated, so go ahead and ask your question.
I was wondering, Noam Chomsky, why does the UN not monitor and manage the Gaza as a green zone, and what would it take for it to do so?
The United Nations is not an independent actor. It can act only so far as the great powers permit it to do so, and that means primarily the United States. So in effect, insofar as the United States authorizes and tolerates UN action, it can act. And the United States does not tolerate very much. You can see that from the record. So, for example, simply take the most recent United States veto of a Security Council resolution by Obama in February 2011. That resolution, in effect, called for implementation of official U.S. policy, opposition to expanding the settlements. Notice that that's not the real issue. The issue is the settlements, not expansion of them. There's a very mild resolution calling for implementation of U.S. policy. The United States vetoed it. Take the most recent vote of the UN Human Rights Council calling for an independent investigation of the latest conflict. Was passed unanimously with one negative vote, the United States. As long as that continues, the United Nations is constrained in its ability to act in this or any other situation.
I want to share with you a headline from the Times of Israel from August the 5th. Obama approves $225 million in Iron Dome funding. If you add up all of the military aid that goes to Israel right now for each year, it's about $3.1 billion. So there are some critics who are saying about the US, how can they broker peace in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians and also fund as well? It's a question that came up in a State Department briefing. Have a listen to this, Noam.
How do you think that continuing to supply...
I'll answer when you're done.
Okay. How do you think that continuing to supply ammunition is not furthering this conflict?
Because that's a simplistic reading of what this military-to-military relationship is like. We resupply allies and partners and friends that we have a military-to-military relationship with when there are requests to do so. That is an ongoing process and a fairly routine process. That doesn't in any way further the conflict.
So, Noam, what is your take on the US being both peace brokers and also funders to Israel in terms of military aid and lots of other kind of aid as well? How does that even work?
Well, the military aid is quite explicit. I mean, as you said, Obama recently released additional military aid to Israel, and it's important to look at the context. Obama issued a declaration calling for moderation by both sides, and coupled it with an announcement that new military aid is going to Israel. This, incidentally, is at a moment when U.S. jet planes are smashing Gaza to rubble. So let's send them more munitions, meanwhile pretending to be what's sometimes called an honest broker, actually Israel's lawyer. And this has been going on for 40 years. Nothing new. There's a persistent policy of that kind with very rare exceptions. The United States is also acting unilaterally. Very few countries support this. European Union tepidly goes along most of the time. The international world is strongly opposed. It should be mentioned that all of this is not only in violation of international law, but it's in violation of U.S. law. The U.S. law quite explicitly bans provision of arms to any military units, organizations that are engaged in systematic human rights violations. And there isn't the slightest doubt that Israel is using U.S. arms for human rights violations. So the U.S. government is in strict violation of U.S. law, the so-called ley law, Senator Ley, and also international law, and is also making very clear that its a pretense of being some kind of a neutral broker, called honest broker, is just pure cynicism.
You know, and speaking of these violations of U.S. law, our community is asking, well, why does the support continue? So Professor Chomsky on Twitter, one person says, if normal, hardworking Americans asked would they want to give their tax dollars to Israel, the answer would be no. But as Lehzen on Twitter says, this is linked to U.S. internal politics. Who wants to lose elections? So Professor Chomsky, Would you agree with the sentiment that the majority of the taxpayer base, the U.S. citizens, may not be as in support of these policies as their politicians are?
Well, in this case, there are the polls, which are pretty consistent, shows that a substantial majority of Americans support U.S. policy towards Israel. Recall that it's important to bear in mind that Americans see the media presentation of this issue, which is quite different from what's actually happening. So, for example, what I just said recently is almost inexpressible in the U.S. media. But that proportion is diminishing. Support for U.S. policies in Israel-Palestine is diminishing, and furthermore, the demographics are important. Among younger people, it's changed very substantially. So by now, the support for U.S. Actions with regard to Israel-Palestine is much smaller among younger people, and in fact on college campuses, support Palestinian solidarity is actually one of the biggest issues now. It's a big change in the last 10 or 15 years.
Professor, if you look at the difference between Republicans and the difference between Democrats, does it make any difference who the commander-in-chief is regarding the US relations with Israel? Have you noticed over the years that changing in any way?
Well, it's a complicated situation. By now, the Republicans are considerably more supportive of the Israeli crimes than the Democrats are. That's not a huge difference, but it is a striking difference, and different from the past. A large part of the reason for that is that for various reasons the Republican Party has moved so far off the political spectrum that it's finding it difficult to obtain voters to support its actual policies. The actual policies are radical support for corporate power and private wealth. Can't get votes that way. So they've been compelled to mobilize sectors of the population that have always been there but have never been an organized political force, like, for example, evangelical Christians or nationalist elements who fear that we're being attacked by all kinds of foreigners and so on and so forth. That has given a very reactionary slant to, it's added to the reactionary slant of the Republican Party, and it's contributed to their support of Israel. Important to remember as well that the primary constituency of both parties is, of course, the business community, and they're pretty supportive of Israel. You take a look at investment patterns. They continue to flow towards Israel fairly substantially. Warren Buffett, Intel, the military industry, of course, very close ties to Israel. All of this, and there's a AIPAC, an effective lobby, which adds to this. There are many factors that contribute to the traditional support for Israeli policies, but it is diminishing. I can tell you how, just from my own experience, quite dramatically, up until a few years ago, I literally used to have police protection on campus, college campuses, when I was talking about this matter, even on my own campus. The last 10 or 15 years, that's changed enormously. By now, as I mentioned, this is Palestinian solidarity is one of the major issues on campus.
Well, Professor, you mentioned those campuses, and we have a few members in our hangout who aren't that far away from campuses themselves. So, Max, I want to go to you for your question.
Sure. Professor Chomsky, I know that you just mentioned AIPAC, and that organization and like-minded ones have sort of had a chokehold over the narrative coming out of the American Jewish community for a long time. So I want to explore if you think that we're approaching any sort of a meaningful turning point there, as perhaps younger American Jews are becoming more progressive or left on this issue. You're indicating from this Pew poll that you think that younger Americans are starting to change their views on this. So particularly, what can young Americans or young American Jews do to sort of get closer towards the inflection point that you seem to hope for?
Well, the general tendency that I mentioned among the population as a whole is also quite manifest in the Jewish population. And this is fairly intensively studied, so there's good polling results on it. And among American Jews, younger ones, there's a very significant change over the past roughly 10, 15 years, distancing themselves from support for Israel and also often distancing themselves from any Jewish connections altogether. So, for example, intermarriage is increasing very rapidly. But the general fact is that Israeli crimes have become so extreme that they're inconsistent with the more or less liberal attitudes held by young American Jews and many Americans. So it's harder and harder to reconcile in your mind support for Israel with your own general attitudes. And that's a striking change over the years, and may indicate a change in government policy over time if activist efforts are taken effectively to mobilize the population on these issues. So, for example, what you mentioned, what we were talking about before, U.S. arms to Israel. As I said, that's in strict violation of U.S. law, international law, of course, and moral principles as well. That's could be a very effective organizing technique, not only to end the dispatch of American arms to carry out extreme crimes, but also as an opening to discussing opening the inquiry into the entire issue and the way it's been presented over the years.
Professor, you've been so critical of US foreign policy over the years. I was just curious if there were any politicians that you actually liked.
That I like?
Yes, or admire.
On some issues. I mean, I can't really list personalities who I like. On particular issues, I do approve of the policies that many of them advocate, incidentally, on both parties.
Professor Chomsky, I have a question kind of following up with what we were talking about. Given that the occupation and generally disagreeable Israeli policies were going on at the start of the most recent hostilities, what do you see as the most ethical response that the Israeli military could have taken under, ongoing missile attacks?
The ethical response on the latest of the Israeli onslaughts. Yeah. Is that the question? Yes. The ethical response is to withhold all U.S. aid to Israel, to compel Israel not to use U.S. arms, to call for a no-fly zone over Gaza, and to request the United Nations to implement it, which they could do, and to put an end to the farce of pretending to try to broker a political settlement when the country is the government is in fact undermining it. The U.S., it's worth recalling that for about 40 years, the United States has almost unilaterally blocked the implementation of a diplomatic settlement, which is not very beautiful in my mind, but is probably the least bad of short-term options, and is supported by almost the entire world, and everyone knows what it is. Two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, or maybe some minor and mutual modifications to quote earlier U.S. policy, with arrangements for the various other standing issues. That's the basic framework for a diplomatic settlement. As I say, I don't particularly like it. I don't think it's particularly good, but I think it's probably the best option at the moment. It has enormous international support. The United States has been blocking it for 40 years. Now recall that this proposal reached the Security Council of the United Nations in January 1976. Now there was a resolution calling for a two-state settlement on the international border with, quoting it, guarantees for the right of each state to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. The United States vetoed it. That resolution was brought by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Same thing happened in 1980. I won't run through the rest of the record, but it's pretty much the same up to the latest veto, which I quoted before. And this goes along with constant, decisive U.S. military, economic, diplomatic support for Israeli policies, and decisive support, and also ideological support in the way the issues are framed.
But what do you see
and the ethical response would be to end all of that.
As the most ethical response on behalf of the IDF, given over 100 rockets sent into Israel in the first 5 months of 2014?
The aid given to the IDF?
Just the IDF's reaction. What do you think the most ethical response should have been?
The IDF's reaction should be to withdraw from the occupied territories and to put an end to... the IDF operates on the orders of the civilian government. It's not an independent actor. Israel's far from a military dictatorship. Civilian government determines policy, the IDF carries it out. I don't think the IDF should carry out criminal orders, or any army should, but the real question is about the civilian government, and of course for Americans the questions are crucially about our own government. Certainly the actions that the IDF has been ordered to take, and often has taken on its own initiative, are very brutal and violent. There's ample reporting of that so that we don't have to review it.
There's one more question coming from our Hangout. Yakub, go ahead briefly because we're almost out of time.
So, recently, a few bills have just passed through Congress, passed through the Senate unanimously. To me, this indicates that our representatives are not trying to represent their constituents. The Gallup poll you mentioned earlier, white people think that what Israel's doing is justified, whereas people of color don't.
All right, Yakub, make the question. Do the question, because we have 1 minute to wrap it up. So go ahead with the question, loud and clear.
Given that Congress doesn't seem to be representing its people, do you feel like right now that the U.S. government can be considered a democracy?
Professor, is the U.S. government a democracy?
Plutocracy. The U.S. government has formal democratic procedures, but in practice it's a plutocracy. There's extensive research from mainstream political science showing very conclusively that the majority of the population has no influence on policies whatsoever. Policies are very largely set by a very small elite based ultimately in corporate wealth and power.
Sure.
Independent state power linked to it, and the public is not totally, but substantially out of the picture.
Okay. All right, so you're listening to Professor Noam Chomsky. If you'd like to hear some more from him, I can highly recommend that you go to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com, and if you can't get to it right now, you can catch it up on our online link a little bit later. Now, I think Malika, it's interesting that the professor, he doesn't have a Twitter page, he doesn't have Facebook, but if you look at him online, there are so many quotes, so many places for you to actually see the things he says. So Professor Noam Chomsky, it's been great having you as a guest. Don't go away. We're going to take you to the post show. Meanwhile, let me tell you about the next AJ stream. Homeless and hungry. Why thousands of people in South Sudan can't wait for a famine declaration before receiving help. We'll dig deeper into that story on the next AJ stream. Until then, see you online. Stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching.